Yay, there we go. Okay. Again, one of the things discovered was sort of thinking about Lang.net last year. One of the things that would, as I'd struck up conversations with a couple people, was the general prevalence of the opinion that writing plugins and examples and so forth for Visual Studio was exceedingly difficult. This, coupled with some actual content work that the Visual Studio extensibility team asked me to do over the last year, led to the suggestion that it might be a good idea to go over what it really takes to create a Visual Studio extensibility plugin for Visual Studio. So what I want to do is I want to just drill, I cannot take all of building a language service. In 15 minutes I can't describe to you what it will take to create something that's roughly equivalent to the C# plugin. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure I could do that in 5 days. It's a tremendous amount of stuff that they do in the production release of the various language plugins for Visual Studio. What I did want to do is just go over the bare sort of essential outlines, and then I'm actually going to go look at one of the samples that shipped with the Visual Studio SDK, the regular expression language service, which is a pretty brain-dead and useless implementation of a language service, but it does give you some basic structure to sort of think about how to build out a language service, give you a basic idea of how language services are constructed in Visual Studio, and hopefully give you at least a starting point for building your own extensibility and plugins to the Visual Studio environment. The first thing you need, of course, is the Visual Studio SDK, free download. It installs on top of / side by side your normal Visual Studio environment. It's important to realize that when you're developing extensions, you don't have to pollute the very Visual Studio that you are using. As a matter of fact, when you run your language extension, it gets a bit surreal. I'll show you what I mean here for just a second. We go over here to the regular expression language service, push F5, and what comes up is Visual Studio. You are now debugging Visual Studio in Visual Studio. And if that doesn't make your head hurt, you're a much better person than I am. That seems just very sort of surreal, particularly when you start alt-tabbing through them. The one thing you will notice over here in the right-hand side of the caption bar, experimental hive. This is basic proof that Microsoft is in fact a collective, and you have now joined it. The experimental hive is effectively a collection of registry keys that store all of the language service things that you need to have in place when you're creating a language service. And there are some shortcuts when you install the SDK that allow you to reset the experimental hive back to its pristine state. The important thing that you need to know about this is it's not going to screw with your custom Visual Studio settings, the one that you use for your production work. Okay, the experimental hive is there exactly for the reason that we don't want people feeling like, you're going to get screwed if you try to develop a custom language service. The drawback, unfortunately, to Visual Studio, as opposed to some of the other development environments in the world, Eclipse, is the fact that there's no source available. And there are no debugging symbols available, at least none that I've found yet. And so debugging a language service can sometimes be somewhat difficult, particularly if you accidentally mix and match the SDKs. At one point, I had both the Visual Studio 2005 SDK and the 2008 SDK installed on the same box, and I had written a language service that was using the wrong attributes on a particular language service. And so it compiled, it ran, and it just never called the methods that I was interested in, and then it would crash. And I could not for the life of me figure out what was going on, because I could step through it, I could set a breakpoint, but the method that I was interested in was never getting invoked, and I was literally pulling my hair out in tufts. And it wasn't immediately obvious until somebody else on a Visual Studio Insider mailing list said, oh yeah, I ran into the same problem about 6 months ago. You're mixing and matching your version attributes. It can be very, very difficult to debug a Visual Studio language service because we can't step into Visual Studio and see exactly how some of these things are resolved. Those of you who work for Microsoft, yes, I know you have access to the source. Please lobby on our behalf. Do something so that we can make it at least easier for us to be able to debug some of this stuff. That's one of the big drawbacks to writing a language service in Visual Studio. The language service itself, it sits inside, it has a number of features available to it. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a bunch of these features from having used Visual Studio. All of these are available to you as something that you can provide for your custom language service. So for example, the F# interactive console that I'm sure Luke is going to be talking about at some point later, this is what's known as a custom tool window in Visual Studio, and these are very, very flexible. You can do pretty much anything you want with them. If you want to have your own custom snippets, if you want to do your own debugger extensions, the Visual Studio environment is exceedingly flexible. Most of the features that you interact with on a daily basis inside of VS are features that are available to you as a language service developer. The way that all of this works is that your language service, your Visual Studio plugin, will effectively advertise the services that it wishes to provide through kind of a capabilities model. So you'll create a package, let's see, let me grab some code here. So this file that we're looking at right here, this vspackage.cs file, this basically, you'll notice the huge slew of attributes on here. These are all effectively advertising what this package, what this regular expression language service provides. So in this particular case, it only provides this one, the language extension type of regular expression language service, and then the extension against which it should register this language service. So essentially Visual Studio is going to be looking at the extension of any file that you open and determining what the language service that's going to be used to handle this particular file based on that. You also provide the fact that this is providing a service, as they use the term proffers. You see that fair amount inside the VS documentation. Both of these attributes are necessary because A, we provide a language extension, and B, we're providing a service, the one being the one and the same. In this particular case, the regular expression service is simply going to be doing some syntax color highlighting. Inside the constructor, you typically don't do anything. The initialization actually takes place inside of this overridden initialize method, where effectively we do two things. We create the language service instance itself and call this method setSite to wire up the package and the service against one another. This is just boilerplate, must be done, don't try to handle it any other way. Part of the reason that we have to be very careful about what we do and where we do it is that Visual Studio still feels a lot of its basic COM backplane that's still there. It's still very much a COM institution. And so, for example, if you look at some of the attributes up here, you'll notice that this is in fact a COM visible type with a GUID. A lot of the various classes in which you will work with the Visual Studio extensions will in fact be COM visible and must have a GUID associated with them. Because effectively we're still calling against the native, the unmanaged code backplane. Okay? The second thing we do is we grab the service container and we add this service to the list of services that Visual Studio knows about. Okay? Once that's done, the rest of this is pretty boilerplate, standard dispose contract here. The regular expression language service itself is a language service class, traditional straight up inheritance here. And you'll notice it's got an instance of a regular expression scanner. We need this later on for we'll scroll down here. Most of these methods are pretty straightforward. Get, format, filter, list. In other words, what are the various filter strings that should show up in the file dialog? What's the name of this service, etc. In this particular case, what we're looking to do is we're looking to create a scanner. The scanner instance is what's going to be used to tell Visual Studio how to color syntax highlight the text inside this editor window. So again, what's happening here is Studio is itself the one that's applying those color settings. This is how it reads the settings out of the sort of universal color settings dialog that you set up inside of your Visual Studio so that you can have bright yellow on red background hot dog stand color scheme. But you need to tell Visual Studio what the various token types that are showing up inside of your source file are. So the regular expression scanner is an instance of iScanner, as you can see here, and it implements one of the longest method names ever in the history of programming. Scan token and provide info about it. Also sometimes referred to as STAPIAI. I'm not sure which one is shorter to say or not. Okay? The key thing here is that token info parameter in the first parameter there, that guy is effectively a waiting package to be filled. The idea is that you will scan across the text looking for the actual token in question. And in this particular case, it's just going to do, as the name implies, a traditional regex that's implemented up here. It's just going to walk through a table of regular expression entries and determining whether or not the character matches one of those. If it does, it hands back one of these token infos. Now again, it's not handed back in the sense of a traditional return. We have to populate token info with those values. And so we set the color, we basically indicate the color, the text type, the current position, and the end position. The string that in fact we're operating on is handed to us prior to this via the setSource method call, giving us the string in question and the offset in which to operate from. Okay? Now, I'm glossing over some of the meticulous details in other places. For example, here in the package, the list of attributes, I'm not going over all of these. The default registry root, for example, the installed product registration. These are attributes that will simply need to be there, period, regardless of what kind of language service you provide. And, again, this is a 15-minute hurricane brief flash overview. The intent here is basically to say it's not quite as difficult as you might imagine. The difficulty, quite frankly, lies in just getting the details exactly right in the right place. You just have to make sure that in many cases that these attributes are in fact the right ones. The versioning mismatch that I ran into earlier was because I had an earlier version of this attribute as opposed to the provide language extension attribute. So just be careful if you start looking at Visual Studio examples, make sure you're looking at the 2008 ones and not at some of the ones that were released with the 2005 SDK, or you will get confused and you will start pulling your hair out, and it's kind of a painful process. Questions? Going once? Sir?
How does the story change in 2010?
How does the story change in 2010?
Before you answer that, can I just have the next speaker?
Yeah.
Just start getting ready?
The story will change in 2010. To be honest with you, I do not know exactly how much they have publicized, so I'm going to speak from the position of I know what they've talked about. I'm not going to tell you what they're doing, just because I don't know how much of this has been decided or publicized. The goal, one of the things that we on the insiders list were screaming, agitating about, was the idea of a simpler registration system. Instead of doing something that was working out of the registry, doing something instead that would operate off of the file system, because it would be much easier to debug and determine that, yes, these are the things that are installed and these are the things that are not. They're obviously not going to be able to completely do away with the registry-based system because, for example, all of the old language services still have to work and they're relying on registering themselves via the registry. But supposedly, 2010, there's some effort underway to try to do it as a file system package management system instead of registry-based. The APIs should not change too much. It's just now we'll be taking it out of the registry and doing it on the file system, very similar to the way Eclipse does things. Okay, thanks.